Hello, welcome to this Facebook Live session. I'm here at the ABC Catalyst Studios. I'm Dr. Joanna McMillan. I'm a nutrition scientist, and I'm joined by my colleague, Associate Professor Andrew Holmes. He's from the Charles Perkins Centre at the University of Sydney, and he was my microbiome maestro, was our nickname for Andrew, through filming this show. And we're delighted with the number of questions that we've got through. I think that just tells us how confusing and how interested people are in the topic of gut health, and how much misinformation that there is out there. And we hope we can answer some of those questions that you've got today. So I'm going to head straight into some of those, and we've got the opportunity to pick Andrew's brains at the same time. So the first question that's come in is, why is IBS so difficult to diagnose? So I'm going to pull in Andrew first, and can you give us a perspective on this as someone who understands the microbiome best?
Well, from the microbiome point of view, the S stands for syndrome, which is usually medical code for there's a bunch of things going on that we don't quite know exactly what's in common between all of them other than the symptom. So the pain's in common, but there's no obvious manifestation, bleeding, inflammation, distinctive microbial profile. None of those things are in common with everybody who has that. So it's a real problem, but there's probably lots of different things that are causing it.
Yeah, and I think that's what we experienced with lots of the experts that I interviewed when we were filming the Gut Revolution. We're seeing the same thing, that it was just frustrating, where they do all the standard medical tests. You do a colonoscopy, you look, for inflammation, you look for problems, you look for all sorts of, and those tests all come back normal. And so if you're suffering with IBS, that is what can be the frustration. And I think in the old days it really was just that. We can't tell what's wrong with you, so let's load you into that bucket. One of the interesting things that I have learned through this process, though, is that there are different things going on for different people. And certainly there was evidence, and we started to be able to see that evidence, that there is actually a very low-grade inflammation going on that just can't be picked up in those standard colonoscopy style of medical tests. So, Andrew, do you think that it's going to get easier to understand IBS and to diagnose it moving forward?
I don't know so much about IBS, but certainly broadly speaking, those functional gut problems, of which that's just one of them. I think that what we're starting to see is that there's lots of different factors that come together in these problems. So, and that came out in the show last night, that you need to look at people's their personal life, as well as their diet, as well as their microbes and other aspects of how their body's working. I think that one of the more exciting things that we can imagine coming in the near future is being able to integrate things like gut microbiome tests with those other tests to be able to better stratify people into different types of categories, such that you can actually get more meaningful programs to help them out. Yeah. And
that's a good point. I think there's absolutely no doubt that the bugs living inside the gut are involved in some way, either in whether it's causation or whether it's simply exacerbation of symptoms. We don't really understand that yet, but there's no doubt that they're playing a role.
Yeah, I like to think of them as being a part of us rather than something that's doing something to us. So basically, when we're sick, they're sick too, rather than that they're making us sick. So think of them as a part of the system that goes along for the ride, for better or for worse. It's a marriage.
Yeah, nice. So Tessa has asked, I get bloating a lot and I eat really healthy, have also had a pot belly since a very young age. What could be causing this? So I think, first of all, that really raises the question of what is normal gut function, what is bloating. And all of us, to be honest, will get bloated from time to time. I always ask people, well, when do you get bloated? Is it when you have one slice of bread, or when you overate and you ate far too much bread and you literally just ate too much, and then, foods like bread will absorb a lot of fluid into the gut, and then suddenly you feel all bloated and distended. So I think that's the really first question to ask. Do you have any further comments on the bloating aspect?
Not particularly, no.
Yeah, so it can be excessive gas production. Certainly I've known lots of people who literally show me they look quite pregnant when they're having a bloating session. So I think it's differentiating that where there really is a problem and you're at the end of the spectrum, or where you've got what is just normal gut function. I had a very humorous, about a serious topic, but a humorous conversation with a top gastroenterologist who said to me, we've got a problem here that we live indoors so much more, and of course farting is not socially acceptable. And so we're all holding in our farts far too much. So I wonder if part of this gut problems that we're having is also we're spending a lot of time sitting down, not enough time doing active. And as soon as you're active and you walk, you might notice that you often go to the toilet after you've gone for a run or after you've gone for a long walk. movement is also good for getting your gut moving, and that may well be part of the problem. I think the last thing I've got to say on the whole pot belly is it may just be your posture. So again, relating to that, the amount of time that we spend sitting, often people's posture gets out of alignment and your pelvis is tipped forward, and actually that gives you a pot belly in the first place. We've got a new question coming in from Jenny, who asks, constipation is a big problem for me. Any ideas?
Well, the right type of fibre. So we hear a lot about fibre, but fibre is a little bit of a dumping ground for anything that doesn't fit into the normal things that we're able to digest. And so having those sorts of fibres that help you basically retain water and get a smoother, softer stool is the single best thing that helps. So I'd say just eat more veggies and drink lots of water. It sounds simple, but if you've got too much meat, too much sugar also, you'll end up with a drier, harder stool.
Yeah, so lots of plant food really, and I guess, you know, from my perspective, if we look at nutrition research over the last few years, while there are still some controversies that we're arguing over, it's really the minor details. The big picture is that pretty much everyone agrees we need to eat more plant food. And what I found interesting working with your team, Andrew, at the Charles Perkins Centre was that you're now talking not about fibre but about MACs, which are the microbiota accessible carbohydrates. So these are really the fermentable fibres. And what seemed to be very, very clear to me in terms of dealing with constipation and with other gut problems was that in order to have that diversity of gut bugs, we need to have a diversity of these fermentable fibres, or MACs. So not just veggies, but fruits, nuts and seeds, you know, whole grains in their whole form, not refined, legumes, and we'll come on a little bit to talk about resistant starch. So it's getting that broad range of fibres that seems to be really, really key.
Yeah, the bugs are what we eat. And so if you eat a more diverse range of foods, you'll have a more diverse range of bugs. And it's probably also worth noting that it's not just about the types of fibre, but the context or the balance in which you're taking that, because just like we can't live on sugar alone, neither can the bugs. They also have to have sources of protein and other things as well. Yeah. So having that fibre as part of a balanced diet is really important as well.
And actually one of the most interesting studies that I read lately was actually about the impact, which came from Professor Felice Jacka, who is another of my experts on the Brains Trust panel. And Felice sent me a really interesting paper lately that was talking about the benefits of fasting for the balance of those gut bugs. So it's almost as if you've got to feed them those good fermentable fibres, but then you've also got to help the wee bugs that survive living off mucus and the other, just the natural secretions that are present in the gut. Is that what's happening with fasting?
Yeah. This concept of balance is a term that we often hear thrown out as it's almost like just settle down, it's just balance. But it's actually an important concept, because to have anything that stays stable, you need to have both push and pull factors. Yeah. And some of the bugs that do very well when we eat a lot, that are helping process the excess food that we might take in, if you get too much of them, that's no good. And what counterbalances them is the bugs that do better when we're fasting, that are cleaning up the other things behind. So that periods of fasting, periods of eating a lot, mixed together gives you that balance.
Yeah, so at the very least, I always say to people, at least have a 12-hour overnight fast. So that means no eating after dinner, you know, and at least 12 hours until you're eating again in the morning. Gives a really nice break to your gut, and pretty much all of us can do that if you struggle with the idea of a longer-term fast. Okay, let's move on. Now, this was a topic that was very clear from Melissa if you watched the show last night. And by the way, if you missed the show, you can watch it on ABC iView, and it will be up there for some time. So the question was, why are onion and garlic often an IBS trigger? Well, I'll start just by saying that this is related to this idea of FODMAPs. So onion and garlic have these particular little short-chain carbohydrates. They're sugars, but not like table sugar. I don't want there to be confusion over that word. Sugar to a scientist are simply these sort of shorter chain carbohydrates, and they are fibers. They're prebiotics because they pass through, and they are through your small intestine. They're fermented in the large colon. But for some people, those particular carbohydrates are problematic and cause excessive gas. They cause excess fluid to be pulled into the colon, and that can result in a diarrhea type IBS. Do you have anything to add to that in terms of onions and garlic? Yeah, so the reason different vegetables taste differently is because they've got different types of sugars that the plant is using to store its own energy, and when we taste them differently. And so those FODMAPs are things that we still can't digest, but they're at the easier end of the spectrum for the microbes to digest. So we're feeding the microbes
but we're feeding them in ways that they can potentially grow a little bit too fast, and that's where the problems can start with that sort of thing. So the low FODMAP diet is something that you might do to help things settle down a bit again. So they're not necessarily bad in the long term, but in the short term they can be. The other problem with those foods is they've also got a bit more sulphur, and sulphur can drive, well, it can make your farts smell worse, and it can also drive other problems within the gut as well.
And what was interesting though with Melissa, our case last night, was that she did seem to have fewer of those bugs that were able to ferment those types of foods. So is that potentially a common problem?
You have to be really careful when you talk about how many she had. So the sorts of analyses that you do when you look at the gut microbiome are what we call relative abundance. So we're not actually measuring how many of those bugs she had. What we're measuring is how their numbers were relative to the other bugs
so
that she had. So
we're back to that balance idea.
So she could have had a high number of those. It's just that she had a lot of other things as well. So we couldn't see the absolute number that were there. It's quite clear that she was reacting to them though.
Yeah. Okay, the next question then is, what do antibiotics do to your gut microbiome? That's a great question. You answered this so succinctly before.
Yeah, they kill them.
They kill them. There you go.
So antibiotics is something, there are occasions when we have to take them. They're life-saving. But antibiotics, particularly broad-spectrum antibiotics, really do knock around your microbiota and dramatically reduce the total number of bugs that you've got there. And when that happens, it's basically a lottery. Under normal circumstances, you will actually recover from a dose of antibiotics. So you'll see the microbiota numbers go down 1,000-fold or more, and then they'll return as soon as you stop taking the antibiotics to normal numbers, but the diversity takes a bit longer to come back. It's usually about 5 to 6 weeks before everything's completely back to normal. And essentially that's just giving you a risk that something might go awry.
Yeah, so a potential pathogen might be able to come in and get real estate almost.
Yeah, there is a window. In fact, there's quite a lot of evidence that some diseases, the risk is actually quite significantly enhanced in that window just after you've taken antibiotics. So there are risks associated with taking them as well. But they're not at the level where you should panic every time that you prescribed antibiotics. It's just an extra factor that you should take in, is this could be
so really the take-home message is antibiotics should be used where they really are required.
And not otherwise.
And not otherwise. Don't take them, just because you think that you've got and particularly for things like colds and flus. These are normally viral. There is no point in taking antibiotics. And I think that's a very clear message. Doctors are getting better about this in Australia anyway, aren't they? Where we're aware of antibiotic resistance as a key problem. And so I think antibiotic use is starting to be better understood. So that's really the take-home message. I think we could perhaps make a comment too about during childhood. That equally applies to your kids. Again, antibiotics should only be used in children when absolutely necessary, and not in a sort of precautionary or preventative manner.
Yeah, there is, again, you've got to balance a number of different issues there, but there is some evidence that excessive use of antibiotics for infants is associated with that increase in allergic diseases that we're seeing in the population. A mild risk of an allergic disease against an acute ear infection that might cause deafness or delay in speech pathology is something that you don't...
Of course, that's a really good point. None of us want to leave our kids with, I can't imagine a single parent who hasn't at some point had to give antibiotics to their children.
Either for their own sanity or for the child's.
Well, they are life-saving, aren't they? That's the thing at the end of the day. Okay, so let's move to the next question. We've got Denny online. Denny asks, is there enough evidence to suggest that gut health may be associated with mental health? Well, unfortunately, we haven't got Professor Felice Jacka here, but I will throw that to Andrew.
Yeah, that's a great question, and the way that Denny, I think it was, asked the question was, is it associated with mental health? And you can give a pretty clear-cut answer there and say, yes, the gut microbiome is associated with mental health, but you shouldn't then leap ahead and say that changes in your gut microbiota are driving some of those mental health issues or not. We're a little ways away from really being able to understand that. But this is a really active area of research, and so there's people who are excited about the idea of being able to have diet-based strategies or prebiotic or postbiotic-based strategies that might be able to help things like depression, anxiety, autism. My suspicion is that there is a place for that, but we should be thinking about that in a holistic sort of context, that basically if you eat better, you'll feel better, which then helps your mental health as well. I don't think it will be a case where you can go off and have a fecal transplant or something to suddenly
be
cure
happy.
depression.
Yeah, I agree. And certainly what we do know is that your diet and your lifestyle have a major impact on your mental health. So we certainly know the Mediterranean diet is a great example. It has been studied extensively, and we do have some great results from using the Mediterranean diet to improve things like depression and anxiety. But it's also worth remembering that some of the research that goes back quite a long way now also links exercise. So lifestyle is inevitably involved here. And to me, the understanding the gut microbiome is just fitting another piece into the puzzle and understanding how all that works and what the mechanisms involved are. Okay, so here's one. Here's one. What foods commonly cause flatulence? Well, I think the first thing to ask is, what is flatulence? We all fart, don't we, Andrew? I mean, if you don't fart, something's wrong.
Something's wrong. Now, I think the other question is that this may have come from a teenage boy who's involved in a competition, so we don't want to be giving away trade secrets for anyone who's doing something like that, but those old favourites, the legumes and the like, but basically anything that's rich in a fermentable fibre. When microbes break those down, one of their waste products are carbon dioxide or CO2, hydrogen and methane. And it's that CO2 primarily that gives the bang to the farts. And if you've got enough of the other two, you might get a little bit of a explosive effect as well. If there's
There you go, teenage boys. So yeah, and I think really the thing with flatulence is to understand when it seems to be excessive and a problem and what is actually just normal bowel function. It is a sign of fermentation going on there. Going back to our earlier question about IBS, I think the other thing to point out is that gas production, what seems to be absolutely apparent in IBS is that there's people who have what we call a hypersensitive gut. So while I might produce the same gas as you with IBS, your gut perceives that as pain, sends a pain message. So it's very real pain. It's perceived in a painful way to you, but my gut copes. So one of the other things that dietitians will often do with people is if you've been eating a very low fibre diet or you introduce a food you don't eat often, like beans or chickpeas, and you're experiencing a problem, your little gut bugs are having a bit of party down there because it's a food they're unfamiliar with. Whereas if you eat those foods regularly and you slowly up your fibre intake and your gut becomes accustomed to it and your gut bugs become accustomed to it, then those foods become much less problematic.
I think a great point that you touched on there is that a lot of this is about perception of pain. So this is an area that we're just starting to really see advances in now, but how the signals come from your gut to your brain via the nervous system, and then also how your brain perceives it, is a big bit to do with what you think is going on. And so one of the reasons why changing diets might be helpful is just that you're changing the signals that your brain's getting. So it's used to processing things in a certain way and saying, that hurts. Then suddenly it's got a signal that it hasn't had before, and we'll let that one fly through. And that may well be what underpins one of the reasons why you can't readily say what's stimulating the pain, but also why just simply changing diet can help.
Yeah, really good. Okay, so we've got Dane who's asking, I have IBS and have found a meat-only diet worked even better than low FODMAPs. Is it the lack of fibre which helps, and how does it change the microbiome? Well, I can probably tackle the first part, and then I'll get Andrew to comment on the changes to the microbiome. Well, the first thing is you've actually given yourself a low FODMAP diet by cutting out all other plant foods. But the trouble is, of course, you don't have any of those fermentable fibres. So I would suggest that long term, that's a real potential problem for your gut health. We do know that high meat diets, in the absence of lots of plant food, particularly if you've got processed foods and processed meats rather in there as well, that is a real risk factor for things like colon cancer down the track. So I would suggest that really that's not a great idea to be following that kind of a diet long term. Even a low FODMAPs diet is a therapeutic diet designed to be used to get symptoms under control, and then with the help of your dietitian you actually start reintroducing some of those FODMAPs to try and retrain your gut. So, so I think just be very careful about following that kind of diet long term. But what about the effect then on the microbiome, Andrew?
You definitely see dramatic no, I've never seen a person who's been on a meat-only diet, but you do see that with animals. So carnivores are like that, and they do have a dramatically different microbiome to omnivores or vegetarians. And the bugs, basically you would have less gut bugs in total on that type of diet. And the ones that you've lost are the ones that we would generally think of as being supportive of, let's call it beneficial immune functions. So bottom line is you'd want to get some fibre and vegetables into that diet as well.
Yeah, so some fibre back in there. Back online now, we've got Jonathan who asks, what happens to your gut microbiome when you switch to a vegan diet? Is it safe? That's a great question.
As long as it's nutritionally balanced, it's safe. So the biggest risk with vegan diets is them not being nutritionally, well, you're the expert on that. So a vegan diet can be perfectly good for your gut bugs, but you would want to be cautious about those micronutrients and the protein levels, and also the protein quality. That's the other thing that can go awry with that.
Yeah, so you're likely to have plenty of fibre, or I should say, as long as you're still eating whole foods. You know, I've seen people who follow vegan diets that are just highly processed, packaged vegan diets. So you want to make sure that regardless of what diet you're following, the basic foundation is to eat real whole foods as much as possible. So the things with a vegan diet that I would say from a nutritional perspective to watch for are, yes, the quality of your protein. You can get plenty protein from plant foods as long as you have a diverse range of different plant foods and you combine those foods together. But the things that you can't get are vitamin B12, which you won't become deficient in quickly, but you will over the years if you don't supplement with B12. It's only available in animal foods. And you would want to watch things like long-chain omega-3 fats. So these are what are primarily we get from oily fish and seafood. There's smaller amounts in meat and eggs. But of course, none of those foods are in a vegan diet. You will get the shorter chain plant omega-3s, but actually we have a limited capacity to elongate them and make the long chain in our body. So I would suggest you can buy an algal supplement of long-chain omega-3s that's suitable for vegans. So good luck with that. And yeah, it certainly seems to be okay for your gut microbiome. Okay, Raquel is asking, what's the easiest way to test the health of your gut microbiome and understand what that means for your diet? Now, that's a really great question, Andrew, because I've already had someone email me about this. Just tell us a little bit more about that DNA sequencing that we did on the show.
So this is a great question. The first thing I'd want to say is to come back to this question of what's normal. So when you look across people, you pick out 100 people around you today and have a look at them and ask what's the easiest way to tell who's healthy or who's not. And the bottom line is we're all the same but different at the same time. And our microbiome's a bit like that too. So there's no one microbiome that equals a healthy microbiome. So the easiest way to tell if you've got a healthy microbiome is to say, do I feel healthy? Yeah. Because it's not something that defines your health or not. It's a part of you. And if you're healthy, by definition, the microbiome that you have in there is one that's associated with your health. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not impacting the way in which your body is working. So it's probably a better way to think about it is, what's the best way to predict how my microbiome is impacting the way my body works? And those sorts of tests that we saw in the program last night, basically you've got literally hundreds to thousands of different species of microbes in there, in a whole community that is trillions of cells. So it's simply not possible and would be very stinky to try and do that if you were culturing all of those. So we use those DNA-based tests because that's where you really can convert everything into a DNA sample and run that through a fancy machine that is able to process millions of these at once and get a reasonable measure of what's there. So what we're doing is looking at ways to get as many aspects of the microbiome measured in one point in time, and then work out which of those are associated with your response to blood glucose or your likelihood to burn fat or store fat, etc.
Yeah. And I think what's worth pointing out then is, because I know lots of people who have just gone and done these sort of poo sample tests where they are culture tests, they're just saying what's in the poo. Now most of those bugs that live deep up inside of us in the intestine, they're anaerobic, so they need no air. So they can't live outside, they won't grow in the lab. So actually those tests, unless you're looking for a pathogen, are pretty useless for understanding the microbiome.
Yeah. Most of the culture tests are focused on the pathogens. The diagnostic tests that we're now starting to see, they're marketed as diagnostic tests, but they're not really diagnostic tests. They're just characterising what your microbiome is. And there's a number of companies that do that now. If you're interested, then it's a great thing to do because you're actually contributing to the, I guess, scientific understanding of the gut. But you shouldn't be doing those thinking that you're going to get a magic bullet answer as to what's causing your tummy upset or something like that.
Yeah, and I think that's what's important. This is a really emerging area of science, and it's why it's exciting to work in the area, but it's very, very important that as members of the public, we don't sort of jump the gun and start to think that this is going to give us all the answers. You know, there are these gut microbiome projects going on all around the world, and that is what's interesting. You know, I had mine measured as part of the show, and we compared all our different results, didn't we? And everyone was quite different, and that's what's important. There isn't one healthy microbiome. Everybody's got lots. There are distinct differences between different cultures, different countries, whether you live rurally or in an urban environment. All of these things really impact. So it's fascinating to look at. So if you want to do the test, bear in mind it is still quite expensive, but you are contributing to science, and it will go into these global gut microbiome projects, so we start to understand more. Okay, so let's move on again to more about treatment. So the question is, what kinds of treatments are proving to be effective in reducing IBS symptoms? So here, you know, we've got to talk about the low FODMAPs diet. That really has been quite a groundbreaker in terms of, now we know that roughly 7 out of 10 people with IBS respond pretty well to a low FODMAPs diet. So look, if you're struggling, my advice is to seek out a dietitian who is specialised in this area. Dietitians are getting up to speed with this and becoming trained, but it's worthwhile just making sure that you see a dietitian who's experienced in delivering the low FODMAPs diet, because as I say, this is not like being a celiac where you have to follow a gluten-free diet for life. This is a therapeutic diet to deal with your symptoms, and then the idea is to start reintroducing those kinds of foods. So please don't put yourself on a low FODMAP diet and then that's it forever. Because we do have some concerns about what might happen to the gut bugs, don't we, with low FODMAPs long term?
Well, it's not meant to be long term.
Yeah.
We also had some discussions with Felice about hypnotherapy as thing, because the IBS it's about perception of pain. So that's another option that you might want to explore.
Yeah, that's a great one. And in fact, we did have one of our volunteers on the show went and did, and this is gut-directed hypnotherapy. So again, it's looking for those therapists who are specifically trained in dealing with gut health. And that really highlights the importance of the fact that emotions, you know, all of us can relate to that. If you think about, you know, if you're going to give an important presentation or a speech, think about what happens. You usually get butterflies and often you run to the loo. Yeah. So it kind of shows us, of course, your emotions are wrapped up with gut health. And for some people, that's even more so. So you might find that your anxiety really is feeding into your IBS, and that's where something like gut hypnotherapy would be really helpful. Here's a really interesting question. Are fermented foods like kombucha and kimchi going to help my gut health? Well, Andrew, you go first.
Not in isolation will something like that be. So they're good foods, but they're not magic bullets that's going to. So particularly the kimchi, which is basically it's a way of making fibre easier to store longer and have. So it's a useful thing, but they're not special. I wouldn't say that they're any better than fresh fruit and vegetables. Yeah. So that's an interesting point. If you do struggle with things like cabbage and so on, having them fermented, the bugs have actually helped you to break down those FODMAPs that are in the food. So you might find that it's easier on your digestion. Whether or not any bugs that are present in these fermented foods are doing us any good, we don't really know. But you know what? We have been using those foods, in my mind, for hundreds, and in many cases thousands of years. And it was done as a food preservation technique, but it just might have some benefits. Certainly in both kombucha and in these fermented foods, there are some acids that are present. And we do know some acids are good generally for gut health. So to me, I don't think it's a probiotic effect at all. And in fact, in kombucha, there's actually very few live bugs actually present in what you drink at the end of the day. But it just might be these acids or even one of the interesting things I found in the show are the dead bugs themselves might be beneficial. So there's historically, we talked about probiotics, which is adding good bugs back.
Live
prebiotics,
bugs.
Which is adding foods that feed the bugs that you've already got. But a new term that's starting to come out now is postbiotics, which is adding in the compounds that the bugs produce. And so that can be the breakdown products of dead bugs. It can be those short-chain fatty acids. It can also be modifications that they make to the polyphenols, these sort of compounds that you find in plant cell walls. And those sorts of compounds are things that can be enriched in those fermented foods, and so they may be useful.
Yeah. So I think they're worthwhile trying. Last question then, is the paleo diet good for my gut bugs? Well, look, I'm going to start by talking about, well, what exactly is the paleo diet? You know, I did a lot of study on the paleo diet in my time at Sydney University when I was doing research, because I did look at some higher meat diets. And to my mind, well, the first thing I think to say is that none of the foods really that were available back in true Paleolithic days are available today. So the whole concept of trying to eat a paleo diet to me is a little bit flawed, but perhaps you've got some comments to make, Andrew.
Paleo seems to cover a range of different things, and let's just say that the more outlandish or trendy versions of that are probably more likely to be, I hesitate to say harmful, but certainly unusual for your gut bugs. So broadly speaking, anything that's whole food is good, and most paleo diets, as people try and operate them, will be basically focusing on whole food, which is good.
Cutting the junk's a great idea. Yeah.
But if you go a little bit too extreme and outlandish, then I suspect that it's like most things. Eat in balance, and that's good. As you get more extreme and restricted, that's also impacting your microbes.
And one of the things actually that we uncovered in the show are the facts that our gut bugs have evolved alongside us. So we didn't stop evolving back then, particularly the bugs, because although it takes a long time for our genes may not have changed, epigenetics tells us we can change a lot about the way we express genes, but the bugs can change very, very quickly. So to my mind, it seems that, you know, we have adapted to more modern diets. The other thing I think when I look at this research is that there is some very good and clear research about the benefits of whole grains. So I always advise people, put your focus on cutting out the junk and cut out the highly refined, highly processed. That's where you get processed fats, the processed carbs, that's where and the processed protein. You know, all that rubbish is what we need to go. And if we just move back to whole foods, for most people, that's going to make an enormous improvement, both to their health and their little gut bugs along the way. Okay, well, look, that's enough questions. I think we've run out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today. The second episode of our Gut Revolution is on ABC Catalyst next Tuesday night at 8:30. So we hope that you join us then. And thanks so much for joining us today and for throwing all your questions.
Thank you.